And what we're going to cover is really how do you confidently assess if someone has been exposed? And part of why I prioritize this presentation is if you miss mold, you can know anything and everything there is about mold, and it's going to be useless because the patient that needs it the most is the patient who won't be getting it. And what I see happening all over the place all the time is kids have signs of mold toxicity, but because a provider misses it, and it's not their fault, it's the lack of our community in bringing the awareness and education level up to a point where people have the understanding of how to identify this. But because of this, people will go and start chasing after all kinds of other zebras where the gorilla is sitting right in front of you and you're missing it. Um, okay, this power. So as always, this is a conversation around kids. I have no experience on adults, so take this for whatever you will as it pertains to adults. But at least in now, God, I don't know how many kids I've seen. Everything that I'm sharing is at least the most accurate information that I believe is relevant to the kids. And before we get into that, what I felt inclined to share earlier, and we're going to get into all of this at a much deeper level in the future presentation, but part of what I see happening often is this need for complexity where everyone is trying to chase after this. And if you treat this, and if you do 15 things, that's what's going to get the patient better. And part of why I wanted to share this information with you is to really impress upon you how problematic this mold-related illness is and how many systems simultaneously get hit in rather profound ways. We already talked about the gastrointestinal tract and microbiome. What we haven't yet touched on fully is the profound disruption in the mitochondria and fatty acid oxidation, which is basically the two fundamental pieces of our metabolism. And when the mitochondria get hit, they start throwing off multiple other systems, which then throws the system into the whole body into this tailspin. Mycotoxins can cause cerebral folate deficiency, which can obviously cause all kinds of weird abnormalities because of folate, one of the primary vitamins and cofactors that the brain needs to produce all the other brain chemicals, is off. All kinds of weird neurochemical abnormalities will show up in the brain. You get weird disruptions in the lipid membranes of cells. Protein synthesis gets screwed up, which is why I think one of the reasons why some of these kids present with severe failure to thrive is literally their ability to produce the proteins they need to grow have been stunted. You get abnormalities in cellular function. You get abnormalities in antioxidant pathways. So our innate ability to produce antioxidants, including glutathione, gets disrupted, which then obviously creates problems with detoxification. And these toxins, the bacterial endotoxins and the mycotoxins, are hepatotoxic, and they themselves disrupt both phase 1 and phase 2 of detoxification. You get weird changes in hormone balance. So histamine is a stimulant of the entire HPA axis and the thyroid axis. So on one hand, you get activation of the HPA axis, you get activation of the thyroid axis with TRH and TSH simultaneously because mitochondrial function is needed for hormone production. You get weird abnormalities in the adrenal glands. And it's not just cortisol, but testosterone production, estrogen production get wonky. But even though the innate ability to produce hormones is off, these mycotoxins, and we're not sure about the bacterial endotoxins, but the mycotoxins for sure are powerful. They call them xenoestrogens, which is basically estrogens that come from the outside. So you get weird hormonal cascades that take place. And then on top of that, you get neuronal dysfunction. We've touched on this. funky abnormalities in nutrient absorption in the gut, and then just the immune system as a whole goes upside down. So why am I sharing this? Because people have a tendency, and it seems like the further functional medicine goes and the further holistic medical models go, the more desire there is for complexity. And everyone's like, well, if you fix the lipid membranes by giving this fat, and if you do, pump more folate into the nervous system, and then you do glutathione, and then there's a laundry list of things you are told you need to do to get these kids better. But if you stand way, 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 way back and say, what the hell are these toxins doing to the system? And if I get clever enough to understand how to address the core root cause of all of this toxicity and inflammation, can I then address simultaneously all these other cascade of events that are taking place? And I would argue yes. So part of why I shared all of that is not to confuse you. And we're going to touch on these in a lot of detail later on. But part of what I want you to do is to also just start looking at this from my main purpose is to understand how to find mold toxicity. So find mold exposure, understand what the hell is going on in the environment, and then get really, 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 really good at helping fix the gastrointestinal tract of these kids, shore up that gut, get that gut immune response under control, get the systemic neurological response under control, and just focus on that. And if you could do that, and it may seem like, oh, that's so easy. It's actually not. It takes a lot of practice. It takes a lot of understanding of nuances. And if you expend your energy understanding those nuances and understanding those fundamental elements, that will take you a hell of a lot further than becoming micro obsessed at addressing all of these things individually. So with that said, here's what I see as one of the biggest, most significant fundamental challenges to mold medicine or mold-related toxicity. And I think these are two things that are rarely discussed in, certain circles. Because if you don't know how to accurately assess if exposure is basically the causative factor to the picture, meaning someone who's been exposed at some point in time, and that's what derailed the system, then you don't know if you should treat them or not for this, right? And then you may go after, well, they've got iron deficiency, and they've got heavy metals, and they've got this, and they've got that, and a year and a half later of treatment, you're still kind of circling the tube, trying to figure out why this kid is not getting better. And I can't tell you how many times I see this happen, where the kid goes to one practitioner, Dr. So-and-so, who has this wonderful reputation, and Dr. So-and-so, diagnoses whatever thing, treats it, kid kind of gets better, and 2 years later, they're still stuck. And it's not because Dr. So-and-so was not good. It's just they didn't understand the nuances. So part of why this conversation is coming first is, first and foremost, I feel you really need to understand how to identify these kids using certain testing. And I've already shared with you the signs and symptoms, and I'm happy to discuss those at whatever point if you want. And then later on, what we're going to also do is talk about, like, how do you understand if the environment that the child is currently living in is making them sick? One of the things that you saw me share in the prior presentations is if you use the simple anti-inflammatory regimen, the Miraca, the histamine, digestum, zinc, and vitamin D, and the kid starts making good progress, the likelihood of scary things being in the environment is less. It doesn't rule it out, but it's less. So we already touched on that, but we're going to get into this a little bit later. So this presentation is going to be chopped up into two pieces. First piece is really, how do you identify mold exposure through some of the testing? And then how do you use conventional testing and stool testing and other things to kind of fill in the rest of the gap? And this is where we'll also talk a little bit more about testing the gut immune response and gut integrity. So I want to share with you some cases because I think it really highlights the point that I'm trying to make. So this was a little guy. I recently saw him, 6-year-old, tired, low endurance, doesn't like school, struggles to sit still, gets hyperactive if there's too much going on. So lots of sensory stuff, very picky eater, poor appetite, needs Flonase, otherwise his nose gets severe congestion, and he had his tonsils taken out a few months ago. So I thought about this. I'm like, okay, this kid may have mold exposure. And if you guys can see right here, so this is the mosaic organic acid. So we did serum testing. Everything looked fine. The MMP9 is a marker for tissue inflammation, if you want to say, basically a disruption of the tissue matrix. And we'll get into this in part 2. But all his labs look fine. He had a bunch of allergies. But what stood out right here was this tartaric acid. And we're going to touch on this in more detail. But tartaric acid plus these oxalates that are right there are actually two very telling signs that a child may be exposed. They're not absolutely confirmatory, but they are highly suggestive. And then when we ran his antibodies, what you see is he had some pretty decent elevations of these aspergillus and penicillium markers. And I'll touch on this a little bit further. He had a little bit of an IgE allergy response, and another type of aspergillus was triggering an IgA response, which is basically a mucosal tissular response in reaction to the molds. So this case was easy because everything lined up. Urine results are like, oh, shoot, yeah, this looks like mold. And then blood test results also look like mold. And now the family is going to check to see, if they have an issue. Here's another case, though. This was an 8-year-old male who presented with anxiety and ADHD, so highly distractible, hyperactive, learning difficulties all over the place, really struggles to be in social settings because of his sound sensitivity, some obsessive tendencies, nasal congestion, trouble falling asleep. So in the back of my head, I'm like, my God, this has to be mold. Like there's no way anything else causes this constellation of stuff. Because I mean, if he had just the obsessive tendencies and anxiety and maybe anger, like you can argue, well, that could be Lyme and Lyme co-infections. Other things can cause parts of this, but this total picture rarely is caused by anything other than mold. Ran the blood work. Really, the only thing that popped up was, again, this marker that is suggesting that at some tissue level, the matrix of his gut, of his tissue, is highly inflamed, and his anti-nuclear antibodies, which are a marker for autoimmunity, were marginally elevated. 1 to 80 is not terrible, but it's a sign that his immune system is acting up. And again, we'll touch on this a little bit later. Mom wanted to do everything, so we did. We ran his urinary mycotoxins, which came back very unremarkable. We ran urine organic acids, and it also came back unremarkable. There were no oxalates. There were no mitochondrial issues. There were no fatty acid errors. Like everything looked really unremarkable. So then I was like, okay, maybe the blood test is going to show something. And the blood test really also came back unremarkable. And I'll expand on this a little bit. To me, a significant possible, again, never confirming, probable exposure to mold is if these IgG antibodies come back above 30 milligrams per liter. You could see his were really not that exciting. So, I'm scratching my head. I'm like, Jesus, what did I miss? How the hell did I don't know what the hell is going on. And in the back of my head, I'm like, God, do I have to put this kid through some more blood? Maybe this is Lyme, even though the history didn't really add up. Am I missing some kind of environmental toxin? Maybe there's some kind of, other thing lurking in there. Parasites, could this be parasites? Literally, these were all the questions that went through my head. Except the mom was kind enough and proactive enough that literally I just made mention, like, I don't know if this is mold, but if you want to test your environment, here's the dust test. You could do it, or we can wait for the test. And she was just like, screw it, let's do it. This was the dust test. So level 5 is basically you're in the top 10 percentile. And this is the top 10 percentile you don't want to be in, meaning this is the most heavily contaminated, one of the most heavily contaminated homes. And the folks that do this test, they basically collected, I think, 100 or 10,000 samples and basically ran their own statistics. So these contamination levels were in the top 10 percentile of all contaminated homes that they ever tested. Code 1 through 3, and we'll touch on this in the next part, is basically the least 50th percentile. So these are basically super clean homes. Code 4 is it's may have contamination. Code 5 is like, oh crap, we probably have contamination. And why I highlighted this is Stachybotrys is the classic black mold, and anything above 10 is what I was taught to pay attention to, is suggestive of contamination. And Chaetomium is Stachybotrys' ugly cousin, and anything above 5 over here may be suggestive of contamination. So why did I share this with you? In this case, even when I did everything right to the best of my ability, and even though we used the right tests, and I supposedly know what I'm doing, right? After 1,000 or so patients, this was one example where, despite all of the testing, had the mom not done this test, I would have been the one that would have been scratching my head wondering if this is mold. This is how easy it is to miss it. And this is how unreliable these tests can be. And the reason why I shared this case with you was actually this is the first time that I've had both organic acids and mycotoxins and the antibodies fail. Usually one of them comes up positive, if not more than one. And you will encounter these cases. So I want you to just ingrain this into your mind, because all the tests that we have at this time are fallible. And if you don't appreciate that and you take one of these tests at face value without critically thinking about it, you will miss mold. And by doing that, you will also hinder the child's ability or patient's ability to heal. So how can we assess it? So we've got basically 3 different ways. You've got urine mycotoxins, and that's basically someone pees and you check their urine via different technologies, and we'll touch on that, for the presence of these mold toxins. Organic acids is my simple explanation to patients is we're checking the biochemistry. And in checking the biochemistry, what we're doing is basically looking for organic byproducts for things that don't belong there. So if our biochemistry gets mucked up, we start leaving footprints of this through mitochondrial errors, fatty acid errors. And because the yeast and fungi are living organisms, right, they create their own biochemical footprint, such as the tartaric acid and some of these are other markers. So basically, by using this test, and the organic acid test remains one of my favorite tests, except when it comes to diagnosing mold, it's still highly fallible. And then there is blood testing, and we'll touch on this a little bit later. So first and foremost, I want to really impress upon you how inadequate our current diagnostic tools are. And some of this I shared with you before, but we're going to go through it again. This, you look at this, and this was actually my first patient ever with mold that I came to realize was mold. And that was thanks to the mom. So this was a child who had horrible PANS, like off the charts, anger, aggression, destructive, anxious, OCD, a whole 9 yards. And we were chasing after everything, trying everything. And the mom was like, hey, could this be mold? I'm like, oh, I don't know. Right. And we ran this test and I'm like, I don't think this is mold. Except I was wrong. How about this kid? Does this look terribly bad? Like if you would to look at this, would you say, oh my God, this is for sure a mold contamination problem? Probably not, right? Yeah, you'd see the gliotoxins, but everything else looks normal. So you probably go and start thinking of something else. Oops. And then for those of you that use organic acids, you look at these tests and you're like, well, that doesn't look terrible. Oh my God, no, this kid has a Clostridium imbalance. Maybe I should treat the Clostridium because that's what's causing it. And so many providers, so many teachers of the various courses teach you to think in this very black and white, this marker is normal and therefore there is not a problem. This marker is abnormal, therefore it is a problem and you should treat it. Get out of that mindset. I beg you to get out of that mindset and start looking at these patients as a whole. And if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And trust your instincts and your judgment before any test. This is the reality of where we're at. First of all, there's no FDA-approved test to look at this. If you talk to 10 different experts in this community, every single person would have a different opinion in terms of which test is ultimately best. And ultimately, if you are not borderline paranoid in searching for mold, you will miss it. You will for sure miss it. And here we are. This is where we are. We think we're really advanced. We are far from advanced, and we are probably more in the Stone Ages than we are in the 21st century as it comes to diagnostic ability to assess accurately mold-related illness. So going back to that first patient, this was the initial test. Family moved out of the home, and basically the mom had someone come test the home. The guy found so much mold in the home that literally the mom just got up, took a handful of clothes, literally left all their furniture, all their couches, bedding, everything, literally just got up and moved the family to another place. And just by moving him out, after a few months, he started calming down. But I did nothing. I did nothing for this kid. I literally didn't detox him, didn't do a darn thing. He went from this to this. After 3 years, and again, I had not done a whole lot in terms of detoxing. This is what his urinary mycotoxin looked like. His organic acids were showing some fungal markers a year out. But what's weird is, again, I didn't do a damn thing, and all of a sudden that tartaric acid just happened to disappear, even though I didn't treat it. This is how unreliable our current technology is. And we don't talk about this often enough. We don't have enough people saying, hey, these organic acids have all these flaws, all these limitations. And if you're not careful and you blindly just use them, you will miss critical data points that will actually confuse you in your ability to understand how to help a child. Here was another low one. So this is a 2-year-old that came to me because of all kinds of weird sensory issues. He was tired. He had growth delays, highly reactive, highly irritable. If he was a little bit older, he'd probably be placed on the PANDAS, or maybe even autism spectrum. Now, what we came to realize was they actually had a boatload of mold in the home that they were living in. And this was his initial organic acid. Now, the mom initially was like, dude, you're out of your mind, because she was a practitioner herself. And she's like, this isn't mold. We don't have mold. This can't be mold. So I kept nagging her to death. And after a little while, we repeated it. And this was the repeat test. So these fungal markers all look obscenely normal. A year later, suddenly, oh my God, they're anything but normal. Now, one of the things that did stand out that had me kind of question what was going on were all of these mitochondrial markers and all of these fatty acid markers. So when the electron transport chain, basically the process of producing energy production within the mitochondria, goes wonky, you get these elevations here. And so fatty acid oxidation is when you eat fat, the fat gets broken down, ultimately goes to acetyl-CoA that gets dumped into the Krebs cycle, and voila, gets turned into energy. If that process is messed up from fatty acid oxidation, the acetyl-CoA coming in, if that gets messed up, you get elevations of this. And some of this I'll touch on a little bit later, but I was scratching my head. I'm like, there has to be some kind of toxin screwing this up. And one thing that I want you all to start looking at is when you see these markers, even in the absence of anything else, you need to be thinking in the back of your head that there's some kind of toxin. You don't know what. It could be something else other than mold. Some kind of toxin is screwing up this kid's metabolic functioning. Now, if you add to that a spike in oxalic acid or glycolic acid, unless a kid is pounding spinach like it's going out of style, the likelihood of oxalates coming from the diet are much less. And really, only when the gut gets messed up and you get pretty heavy fungal imbalances do you get big spikes in this. So sometimes you don't see these fungal markers acting abnormal. What you do see are the metabolic markers acting abnormal, and then a big spike in the oxalates, which then could suggest that there is a fungal component. What we see in this guy is all of a sudden this test oxalates looking okay, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh crap, oxalates are now through the roof. And he still has some of the markers, although they're not looking as bad. So if you see this in the back of your mind, you need to cringe and say, oh my God, is this some kind of mold-related exposure with a heavy fungal imbalance in this kid's gut? This was his initial mycotoxin. Doesn't look terrible, right? This was his mycotoxin a year out. Again, still didn't treat him. Just a year out, we did nothing at all other than test. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's not good, right? Look at that gliotoxin. So gliotoxin went from 0 to now suddenly being at 9,592. How many times have you had people say, well, if you see gliotoxins, use this. If you see this toxin, use that. Do this for this toxin, chase after that toxin with this. And if you do somersaults and stand on your head, then gliotoxins will get better. If you look at enough of these cases enough times, what you see is these kinds of conversations are silly, because basically what you're doing is playing a game of whack-a-mole with data from laboratory testing that's completely unreliable. And these conversations around like, oh, you should approach gliotoxicity with this. And it's not to say that some of those treatments can't be helpful. And it's not to say these toxins aren't problematic. What I am trying to say is you need to understand that chances are all of these toxins are present at the same time. Endotoxins are probably there right after them. And this combination of total toxicity plus God knows what else is floating through this child's body is what's causing the problem. And it's not like, oh, this gliotoxin was super elevated, therefore I'm going to do this to fix it. Don't get caught up in the complexity. There are more effective, more efficient, and easy ways to take care of these kids if you understand the bigger picture. This was his third mycotoxin. So now all of a sudden, again, we did a little bit of binders, not a whole lot. Gliotoxin suddenly disappeared, except gliotoxins are then showing up in the follow-up with real time. These tests are totally unreliable. And if we obsess with one result, you will ultimately be misled in how to pay attention. The only thing you can say is like, oh gosh, yeah, there are mycotoxins in this urine, period. End of story. This was a child, one of the worst cases of PANS that I'd ever seen, where he was suicidal, extremely aggressive, high anxiety, and basically during the pandemic completely fell apart. This was his original urinary mycotoxin. God, that doesn't look bad. This can't be mold. This was his organic acid. God, that doesn't look bad. It can't be mold. And one of the things that I want to highlight over here is for you all to become highly suspicious, especially with Mosaic, as much as I love them, highly suspicious of these Mosaic organic acids when you see these markers all trending low. To me, that's a dilution effect, and Mosaic swears up and down that they correct for all of this with creatinine. But when you see this, the first thing that should go through your head is like, God, I don't know if I should trust this test. Now, here's the thing that had me pay attention. So this was his stool test, and we're going to touch on this a little bit later. Stool test looks fine, right? Oh, candida is not a problem. This can't be mold until we get here. He had one of the highest antibody responses that I have yet to this day seen. And I probably run, I don't know, 400 or 500 plus of these antibodies on these kids. He had one of the highest immune reactions that I've ever seen to mold. And when the dad, they didn't bring some fancy holistic, go through every nook and cranny of the home kind of inspector. He brought the average inspector off the street who, may or may not even know what the hell they're doing. And this average inspector looked at the home, and after just a visual inspection, his word is, this home is so heavily contaminated, you need to get the hell out of here. It turns out that the home was not built to code, and the air conditioning unit was installed where the intake was actually sucking air from the subfloor. And on top of multiple leaks and on top of multiple areas of water intrusion, it turns out that this home's subfloor was trapping moisture, so lots of water constantly going under the home, creating a huge amount of mold growth in the subfloor. And every time they ran their air conditioning, this air conditioning was just sucking that moldy air out of this greenhouse, essentially, and dumping it into the living environment. Ultimately, just getting out of that home, literally just getting out of that home within several weeks allowed this kid to calm down by 50%. Now, in this case, if I had used this as my primary diagnostic tool, if I had used this as my primary diagnostic tool without running this, I would have been chasing after everything else. Oh, maybe this is strep. Let me give him an antibiotic. Oh, maybe this is Lyme. Let's test for Lyme. Oh, well, this test didn't show. Let's use another test. And we would have missed this. And ultimately, this poor kid would still be suffering and sick. And good news is we're 2 years out and he's doing awesome. He is thriving. He is happy. He is well adjusted. He's doing well in school. Happy, healthy kid. That same mold toxin test, 9 months later, we repeated it just for curiosity's sake, and it was actually an outside provider. All of a sudden, not normal. This is another patient. Subtle things, tooth grinding, some digestive issues, fatigue. Doesn't look terrible. Oh. After they remediated because they found mold, all of a sudden, totally not normal. Another child, learning disabilities, even though highly intelligent, depressed, anxious, OCD, kind of the typical PANS ADHD picture we see. I don't know if this is mold. This doesn't look terrible. Oh, look at that. Is this mold? It was. And here are the antibodies for this child. Also, again, way above at least my threshold of 30 milligrams per liter. All of a sudden, look at that. The urinary mycotoxins are highly positive. And this is the problem. First of all, these tests are very unreliable in kids. Now, you can argue for adults, especially if you can do provocation, they're probably going to look more like this consistently. Because one of the things, and you'll see it in a future slide, one of the things that we see is it really appears that kids who are sick just lose the ability to clear these mycotoxins through their urine. But there's something more to it than that. So first of all, this is according to the CDC. Mycotoxins are metabolites of these fungus, blah, 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 and they're found in food. And therefore, mycotoxins are found in the urine of healthy people. So if you use a urinary mycotoxins to diagnose mold toxicity, you can get yourself in some pretty deep water because of this. And then they go on to say, well, urine mycotoxins are not FDA approved or accurate. So when you use any of these tools, you always say, well, this test is suggesting there's exposure. I am concerned there may be exposure. Let's look further, right? And when you're documenting, document the actual clinical issues the kid has: abdominal pain, allergies, eczema, ADHD, autism, not mold toxicity, right? We don't diagnose mold toxicity ever. Make sure you put that into your head, and that's one way to keep yourself out of trouble. These are three studies, and if you follow Dr. Andrew Campbell, like he harps on this big time. Urinary mycotoxins were originally created to actually look at food-related toxicity. And what all of these studies say is basically these urinary mycotoxins are strongly correlated to ingestion of mycotoxins through food. And what do we see? Well, here's one example. This was a mom who was freaking out. She's like, oh my God, my mycotoxins are so bad. And we had already tested the home. We knew the home was clean. She's freaking out. She's like, oh my God, we have mold. We're going to have to move out. The end of the world. And kid was doing fine. I'm like, I think this is your diet. Now, one of the things that I want you to pay very close attention to is look at the difference of these ochratoxins and gliotoxins in ratio versus the zearanolone trichothecenes, right? So almost 2 times elevation. This was more, 3 times, not even elevated. This was 7 times. This was 5 times. Mom cleaned up her diet, took out gluten, dairy, corn, peanuts, all of the stuff that's moldy. And this is what her tests look like afterwards. All of a sudden doesn't look terrible, right? And I would argue that if we waited a little bit longer, these ochratoxins would probably drop down further. Another family, similar picture. Oh my God, end of the world. This is awful. Retested and everything came down quite nicely. And the two categories of mycotoxins that I see regularly impacted by diet is the ochratoxin and gliotoxin. So if you ever use real-time labs, pay very close attention, because if the ratio of this and this versus the others is off, make sure that you've checked the kid's or person's diet before making any big conclusions. Now, this is where I realized we had a really big problem, and frankly, why I've pretty much altogether stopped using urinary mycotoxins is not just because of the food. It's because of the wild differences in excretion patterns depending on the person's physiology. So these were 2 people living in mold, right? Known exposure. And we had tested the kid, but the parents were kind of curious. Mom's labs, it's kind of there. And then dad's labs, oh crap. And in this case, it wasn't because dad was eating pounds of gluten, dairy, peanuts, so forth. Their diets were actually pretty similar. Mom and child. Oh my gosh, yeah, this doesn't look good. Oh no, there's no mold. Same home, same diet. This is how easily you can be led astray if you're not paying attention. And especially in kids, there's just huge variability in how mycotoxins are mobilized into the urine. So why would you ever want to use urinary mycotoxins? So one of the things that can be helpful is to look for trends. So once you establish a baseline, if you do choose to use them over time, and I've come to a place where I've pretty much stopped using them, and what we'll talk about in the future presentation is how for us to really understand the gut immune response of these kids and to really focus on that. But I personally don't use these mycotoxins anymore, but you can make an argument that if you wanted to kind of follow the course of someone's toxicity, they could be helpful for that. Always, 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 always make sure if you're using these tests for several days, if not more, to have families avoid grains, corn, peanuts, dairy, and especially dried fruits. And here are other foods that have mold toxins in them. Now, what kind of tests are available? And some of this you may have already heard, but I'm going to cover it just to be thorough. So basically, there's two different technologies. There's mass spec liquid chromatography, and MSLC is what Mosaic uses. Mass spectroscopy is what Vibrant uses. And really, the upside of that is that the specificity of it, so the accuracy in which it's detecting something, is quite high. The problem is that it will miss a lot of mold often, especially in kids. And as you saw in the multiple cases of a Mosaic, and I honestly have never used, now that I think about it, Vibrant. I've had a few patients use it. The general consensus is Vibrant is not as accurate as Mosaic or real time. And then you've got ELISA, which is a different way of detection. Its sensitivity is higher, but its specificity is lower. And as you're seeing, food contamination can play a part in that. For provocation, so Dr. Nathan is a big proponent of using glutathione to provoke urinary mycotoxins. You cannot do that with mass spectroscopy. You can do that with ELISA. And basically, the way he teaches the testing is you use glutathione in adults, 100 milligrams twice a day. You can push it a little higher if you want for 3 to 5 days, and then do the urine collection. In that patient with severe PANS, the one where the mom just left everything and got out. So I learned the hard way, and I to this day have PTSD from that. I tried glutathione production or provocation on some of the kids, and some of them did fine. I had a few cases like this where I gave them just 2 doses of glutathione and they basically became full-blown psychotic. The mom called me in this case, literally crying. She's like, he is coming after me with a knife. I'm afraid to call the police because if I do, they'll probably want to take him inpatient, and I don't want to hospitalize my son. I don't know what to do. And part of why I ultimately stopped using these urinary mycotoxins is I got to a place where I thought to myself, if this test is so unreliable that we have to augment its accuracy with something else to try to make it more accurate, why the hell am I using this in the first place? It's just my opinion. You're absolutely welcome to use them, and I think they still serve a role. It's just become my clinical practice to really not use them that often. So what about organic acids? So I love organic acids. Despite my reservation of their accuracy, I still think it's a fantastic test. For $250, you get a decent bit of information. And I think for a urinary test, it's not bad. You have to realize it's inefficiencies or inadequacies. So there's only 2 companies that do fungal markers. There's Mosaic that has the most expansive kind of microbial marker. And then there is Genova Diagnostics that has some of the fungal markers like tartaric acid and arabinose. The accuracy of those fungal markers is about 50%. So the SN is sensitivity. So basically 1 in 2 times of mold-related toxicity, you will get a totally normal looking test. When especially tartaric acid is elevated, yes, food can sometimes cause these markers to be elevated, but generally speaking, in my experience, when it's elevated, especially when it's significantly elevated, it's not a dietary byproduct. It's actually the child may have colonization, and probably has been exposed to mold. Oxalates are something that, again, I'd see elevated at least 50% of the time. They you cannot say, oh, the oxalates are elevated, therefore for sure you have mold, right? All you can say is, this is a breadcrumb, this is a clue, this is a sign there may be some kind of fungal imbalance in this child's gastrointestinal tract, and this oxalate is a reflection of that. And again, the metabolic markers, anything could cause elevations of these markers, any toxin, glyphosates, heavy metals, anything can cause mitochondrial markers and metabolic markers to be abnormal. So the specificity is very low in my experience when you've got metabolic markers, weird neurological issues, allergy, congestion, atopic, eczema, those kinds of things. Mold goes to the top of the list because most other things do not trigger that allergy reaction. So when you see a picture like this, you need to cringe. You need to cringe and in the back of your mind say, oh, shoot, this sure as heck looks like mold-related toxicity. And it is probably suggesting this kid has colonization. Now, notice I say probably suggesting. That's all we can say with this technology. You can never say, oh, for sure this kid has been colonized. Oh, for sure this is happening. We're not at that level of sophistication where we can say that with certainty. It's probable. It is, I would say, likely, but never 100% conclusive. And again, when you see these kinds of presentations, especially with oxalates that are just flowing through the roof, yes, if this kid loves spinach, if this kid eats almonds all day, every day, plus or minus a few other high oxalate foods, it's possible that it can cause this, but that certainly would not cause the rest of this, right? Spinach wouldn't cause mitochondrial errors. Like oxalates can trigger an inflammatory response, but they generally don't cause these other things. So as you zoom out, and you see like, oh, okay, no, this kid hates spinach. Yeah, they eat some almonds, but it's not like everything. And oh, he's got fatigue and he's got the mitochondrial markers and he has some allergies and he's got the sensory issues and learning challenges. Shoot, this could be mold. Again, kind of a similar pattern over there. Now, what about the mold antibodies? So this was a study almost 20 years ago, actually over 20 years ago, by Dr. Vojdani and Dr. Campbell, where they asked the question, what is the likelihood of having elevations of antibodies against molds and mold toxins? And this is kind of hard to see. We're going to go right here. So what they did find is that for individuals who have been exposed to mold in water-damaged buildings had a significantly higher level of antibodies against Aspergillus niger, Penicillium notatum, Stachybotrys, and this was the mycotoxin they tested. Now, here's the big, I'd say, flag. First of all, again, if you go talk to 10 experts, not all those experts will agree that these mycotoxins or mold antibodies are reliable. If you go out there, there are studies that question the accuracy of this study. And part of why we're using these antibodies is because, unfortunately, at this time, there is no way to directly assess mold toxins in blood, because that was the first thing that went through my head. Like, why the hell are we doing this? Why can't we just check the blood for mold toxins? It turns out that mycotoxins are present in the serum in such low amounts that basically you have to run extraordinary levels of technology to assess it, and it costs several $1,000s per test. Because molds and the mycotoxins are highly immunogenic, again, the idea is, well, if the immune system gets pissed off every time it sees mold, then just look at the immune response because that's cheap. And Dr. Andrew Campbell was the one that pointed out that we can easily check antibodies against varicella. I mean, pretty much all the viruses, right? Viruses are immunogenic, which is how we actually assess for if someone has had an infection, right? CMV, EBV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, mycotoxins are just about the same size as viruses, and they happen to be similarly immunogenic in their makeup. And that is the rationale behind the mycotoxin antibodies. Again, the concerns and problems are no one is in agreement in terms of how accurate these tests are. And especially in the adult domain, you will get a ton of different opinions. I can tell you in the kids, and now 400 to 500 tests in, at least, if not more, the accuracy of these mold antibodies far supersedes any other technology that's out there. Do you use antibodies against the mold versus the mold toxins? We'll talk about that. And one of the things for you to realize is when you see these elevations, at least in my opinion, Dr. Campbell has other thoughts. In my opinion, the only thing you can say is this child has been exposed at some point in time sufficiently for these antibodies to be elevated, period. You don't know where. It could have been their school. It could have been their daycare. It could be at grandma's house. It could be at nanny's house. It could be at the ballet studio. I've seen it at a gymnastics studio. It could be at a past home. It could be in the current home. You don't know. So the only thing we could do is say, well, gosh, this exposure has happened. Now we need to look to see if the current home is clean, to then rule that out and then move on. And there are times the families are like, oh, yeah, we were living in a home 5 years ago and we had multiple leaks. And I kept telling my husband, like, this home is musty. We were all getting sick. He wouldn't listen. So every now and then when you bring this up, like one of the parents are like, yeah, I knew we had mold in that home. So what are the different companies out there? So there's My Myco Lab, which is Dr. Campbell's lab. So they're checking for mold toxin antibodies, which is different than all the other ones. There's ALA-TEST, and we'll touch on that. Real Time Labs does mold antibodies, and then you can also run them through Quest and LabCorp. At least with Quest, I've really questioned the accuracy of their antibody testing. LabCorp seems to be more accurate, except it seems that insurance has almost never covered these antibodies, and families are then stuck with like a $280 bill, whereas ALA-TEST, which I find to be a lot more reliable, is actually cheaper. So I pretty much have stopped using this, and in all honesty, I've never used real-time labs, so I have zero experience in the accuracy of their testing. So I will touch on these two in the rest of this presentation. So why would you do one versus the other? For me, it's really a cost issue more than anything else. The mold antibodies are cheaper. They're about half the price of this. The biggest problem is you're not checking reactions against the mold toxins. So therefore, is it possible that the child was in some kind of outdoor environment and got exposed to gobs of molds, and that's where the immunological reaction came from? It's possible. So the specificity, you can argue the accuracy to some extent, not the sensitivity. The accuracy of diagnosis goes down when you use these antibodies. But again, it's half the price. So this is what I do. I use ALA-TEST almost exclusively because I have found that their sensitivity is quite high. And the cool thing about ALA-TEST is they will actually allow you to break up a test and literally just order. So for the families that don't have a whole lot of money, what you could do is break up the test and do a special order. And on their requisition, you can just order them. You can literally just order these 3 or 4 tests for $10 each. So for $40, you've got a pretty decent immunological screening. This panel is $200, which I've come to really like. And what they're doing over here is basically breaking it down into different immunological reactions. You've got your IgE reactions. Dr. Andrew Campbell argues that IgE is immediate exposure, whereas IgG is past. I don't necessarily find that to be representative of this test. I rarely find IgE to be positive, and when it is, usually it's because there's so much exposure that now they're getting cross immune reactivity, meaning it's IgE, IgG, and sometimes you'll even see IgA pop up. Predominantly, it's the IgGs that are positive. And in my experience, if you get an immune reaction that's above 30 milligrams per liter, it's probably suggesting that there's some kind of exposure. The other thing about this panel, which I really like, is you're also looking for antibody reactions against Stachybotrys. So Stachybotrys, classic black, ugly, toxic mold. It doesn't grow in the outside environment. So when there is any reaction against Stachy, and Stachybotrys is not as immunogenic as these other molds, so their immune reaction is not as high. But when there is a reaction, any reaction, frankly, that to me is a flag that the likelihood of contamination exposure within an indoor environment has been there, and it's probably high. And the likelihood of mold-related illness is now there. When you see IgA reactions, so IgA is a mucosal antibody, right? It's in the sinuses, it's in the airways, it's in the gut. And when you see positive IgA antibodies, that's suggesting that essentially the molds have, and you can see candidas there too. So mold and yeast have caused some kind of compromise of the mucosal lining, and now you're getting a mucosal immune reaction against this. It could be in the sinuses. So if you see positive antibodies, especially against cladosporium, and you've got someone who's just pouring out gobs of mucus, start thinking about sinus colonization and using various treatments to clean the sinuses up. If the child has funky digestion, loose bowel movements, abdominal pain, maybe even failure to thrive, and you've got positive IgA, that could be a sign that they've got colonization within the gut. So it gives you kind of an orientation to what may or may not be present. Now, what about the mycotoxin antibodies? So first and foremost, I think it would be inappropriate if I did not state the obvious conflict of interest. So the same year that Dr. Vojdani and Campbell published this paper, Dr. Vojdani was smart enough to file for a patent for these mycotoxin antibodies, which, as a scientist and businessman, it's like, wow, good for him. That was really smart. Dr. Campbell and Dr. Vojdani are very close friends. And Dr. Campbell runs my myco lab. So is there a conflict of interest in this? Yes. Does that negate the validity of the test? I would argue not. I think it's a wonderful test. I think it is very useful. And if you've got someone who has the resources, it's a fantastic test to consider. And this is what it looks like. So you get the IgE reactions and the IgG reactions, and when it looks like this, then it's kind of a no-brainer of like, oh gosh, yeah, this is mold. This is a child that I had who had severe allergies, adenoid hypertrophy, et cetera, et cetera. And again, you can look at this and be like, oh wow, this is really bad. This child is having a very clear and severe reaction against toxins. Now, how do these tests kind of add up? You can see that they do correlate pretty well. And again, the sensitivity of these antibodies are superior to the urinary mycotoxins. This was another child, urinary mycotoxins the organic acids were positive, so were these antibodies. You can see that the mycotoxin antibodies weren't terribly high, even though we had certain things like marginal liver enzyme elevation and some malabsorption. And I have seen some cases where it does seem that in young children, let's say 6-year-old, 8-year-olds, Their immune reactivity to the mold toxins may be a little bit blunted in comparison to the mold antibodies. I think in the older children and adults, they're very comparable and reliable both ways. Another child presenting. So over here, in this case, we had normal looking organic acids, pretty positive urinary mycotoxins with very positive antibodies. Now, this was one case where it was the opposite. And I'd say about 20% of the time, the mold antibodies will fail. Now, is this because the child has an IgG immunodeficiency? Is there something else going on immunologically where they're not mounting the response? I don't know. I would say that at least in the children that I test for, the IgG deficiencies are certainly present. They're not as frequent as when the antibodies fail. But this was a case where, yep, things were positive. Diet was pretty clean, but the antibodies failed. Now, what does normal look like, right? Normal looks like this, where antibodies, not the case. And in this case, it turns out they had Lyme. Things were not totally adding up. And then we went digging further, and it turns out the history was very much pointing to Lyme. And sure enough, Lyme was the diagnosis. Again, this is where we are. How would you approach these patients? So if they can't afford anything, order the antibodies through Quest, order what you can. You can also get a random urinary oxalate level. Is it totally accurate? No. Is it better than nothing? Yes. If they can afford something, order an antibody test. And then if you can tack on either an organic acid or urinary mycotoxin, that's where you would go. And then if they're like, order everything, I don't care, we want to figure it out, then just get everything you can. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Rupa. So if you've got a team in your office who can order all these tests for you, fantastic. I have no affiliation with Rupa. They make it so damn easy though. Your patient ends up paying probably an extra 20 bucks, 30 bucks, which I don't like. But essentially you just register your account, type in your information, your, licensure, whatever. And all you literally have to do is click start order the test kit gets sent to the patient. They have phlebotomists in their network that can just come out and do the draw. Makes everything easy breezy. So if you're kind of a little tight on resource, this is a way to make these tests happen with less effort. To kind of wrap this all up, you have to understand the limitations of these technologies. And without that, you're going to miss toxicity, you're going to miss the exposure, and ultimately you're going to be struggling to figure out how to help these kids. Have a healthy degree of suspicion. You can argue maybe it's not a healthy degree of suspicion, it's being paranoid. Like in the back of my mind, I've seen enough of these kids where their presentations are now almost enough for me to understand what's going on with them. Understand the prevalence. If you live in an area that has had, flooding, if there have been other reasons why these homes could be compromised, the prevalence of mold could be even higher. And ultimately, sometimes all we get are just a few clues. And when you obsess with, oh, this test was normal, therefore it's not, as you saw in the second case that I presented, you could miss it. And as well-intending as we are and as careful as we want to be, sometimes the technology fails us, and we need to be aware of that. Don't treat a lab. Never blindly trust any lab. Use your clinical judgment and trust what you're seeing in the patient before anything else, and that will carry you the furthest. Second part of this presentation, we're going to talk about conventional labs, stool testing, folate antibodies, et cetera, some of the other ways to look for mold-related illness. And then from there, we'll dive into the environment And then we'll kind of wrap that up with the treatments, and then also really how do you understand what is happening to these children. With that, I thank you guys for being a part of this mentorship, watching this video. I hope it was helpful.